So we are starting a new chapter or a new unit in the series on God's strategy and history. And this section is going to be, as most of you know, election, sovereignty, and free will. This is going to be, as you know, from an Arminian viewpoint. So this is going to be 3 parts, so it's going to be very extensive. We're going to cover a lot of ground, give you a lot of background, a lot of framework in the thinking and development of thinking. A lot of us do things almost unconsciously. We'll say things and think certain ways almost unconsciously because of things that happened hundreds of years ago. I mean, just even in the course of history, we're influenced by things and don't even know that why we say certain things or think certain things. And this is one of those topics that kind of reveals that somewhat. So you should have the history handout. Hopefully you brought it back with you. If you have it, it's a few extras on that chair there. I encourage you to have that as a reference point as we go through this. What we're looking at is in looking at the flow of history. So I'm going to just kind of go back and recap a little bit when you look at that flow of history, how I left off last week. So when we're talking about God's strategy and history, what I really was trying to develop over that 3-part series is to understand that in the working of history, we saw that, in fact, if you look at this screen, it shows certain things that in God's strategy have been reintroduced into the church that seem to have lost their way. You have that first 300 years, which was just this fabulous period where the early church, yes, they had some pretty rough times of persecution, but it was an amazing period that from a theological viewpoint, in a lot of ways, that first 300 years represented a lot of what we believe today. There was a huge shift when it came to Constantine and Augustine. And so we're going to look at that a little more. But what I want you to understand, then there was many years. So you see, there were many years where it became the Bible, the scriptures were almost non-existent for the common people. And where it became really, really dynamic was when certain men of God that knew Greek, they knew Hebrew, they knew how to translate the Bible. They knew how to translate the original languages into the common language, whether it was Martin Luther into German, whether it's Wycliffe into English. And those steps were huge in being able to bring back light into the world, where there was hundreds of years, maybe 600, 700, 800 years, where there was tremendous darkness because the Bible was restricted to people. And that was under the rule and reign of the Catholic Church. And so then you have certain things then that begin to come back. So you see between 1400 and 1600, you see the Word of God is coming into the hands of the people. You had the invention of the press, the Gutenberg press, and 1700s until the 1970s, believe it or not, the presence of God is shown in human transformation on a regional scale. And that would be the series of revivals, historical revivals that took place, starting with the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, and then so forth. We spent a lot of time looking at the history of revival in the United States after, say, 1850. Then you saw also an explosion of missions, the missionary evangelistic movements that began in the 1700s. All of this is part of this awakening that's taking place in the United States and Europe and everywhere. And then the 1900s, we saw a lot of things introduced. You saw the power of God to heal. You saw the gifts of the Spirit introduced. You saw Azusa Street with the gift of tongues, and some of these things are coming back in, right? It's like there's a process of restoration, almost step by step, methodically. God is bringing His church back online, so to speak, empowering us. And so what we see today, the charismatic Pentecostal persuasion has spread. It's crossed every line. It's crossed every denominational line. It's all over the world, and it's probably the largest persuasion in the world today, and is taking more ground than probably any other persuasion that exists. It is absolutely phenomenal, and it's partly what you would expect, that Spirit-filled people would have a fire in them that wants to spread the good news, and they have demonstrated that surely in the last 100 years. So the 1900s also, to the present, it was a place for God's people to find their voice. I think the Word of Faith movement, despite a lot of its excesses, one of the things it did is began to tell the believers who they were in Christ. and that there's an authority that the believer has. And some of these ideas were successfully, if you will, the DNA of those ideas successfully were accepted into the church at large, even among people that are not Word of Faith. It's a really pretty interesting shift that took place. So what the bottom line, what I want you to really understand is we're talking about sequential restorations of the church. I want you to see, my belief is that Jesus is not coming back for a kind of tattered, defeated church that's hanging on by the edge. They've tied the knot at the end of the rope, and we're hanging on, and we're hoping that God's going to come back any minute because it's gotten so bad here on earth. And I just don't have that. I have a more, I guess, victorious approach that I think that he's coming back for, as the scripture says, a bride without spot or blemish. In other words, there's a process that God is going through to prepare us to become even more effective as we continue to move towards the end. So when will the end be? That's a whole nother topic. We're not even going to talk about that. But I am one of these guys theologically that you hope for the best and prepare for the worst. I am not, the imminent return of Jesus is surely true from a scriptural standpoint, but at the same time, I don't necessarily think that he's coming in our lifetime. And so that's why Jesus taught you occupy until he comes, and that we hold it down and we continue moving forward. And I'm not looking for a quick way out, even if it gets tough. But it's interesting, when things get tough, we start talking more about Jesus coming back. But he didn't come back during the reign of Diocletian, and I don't know how it gets much tougher than that. So what I'm saying from a historical standpoint, I believe one of the things that I believe was restored in this process is in the realm of theology. So what you had for so many years, you had the Catholic Church with a monopoly for hundreds and hundreds of years, and then spin-off groups that were kind of persecuted and hunted down. The Inquisition was pretty effective at that. But then you had the real big break that occurred in the Reformation. And that was the first time the Catholic Church no longer really had a monopoly. You had the Reformation, you had a new set of ideas that were coming. The Reformers had many, many things. And we went through the lists on that you see the Catholic handout that you guys have. There are many, many things that they were objecting to. But there were a couple of things they did not object to. One was infant baptism. The Reformers embraced infant baptism. They kept that from the Catholic Church. The other thing they kept from the Catholic Church, which the Catholic Church had all along, was Augustinian theology. And so I'm going to give you some more background in understanding that. So I believe that part of kind of this process of restoration, and as much as people will toss around, well, Arminian versus Calvinism and this kind of thing, it's kind of like, well, who knows what the truth really is. But I have convictions about it because I believe the truth is obtainable. And but I believe that one of the things that's needed to be restored was one of these things that has held on from the Catholic Church. Infant baptism was one of them. And so was Augustinian theology, which I think has a lot of harm that it can cause. So the Reformers, Calvinism didn't come from John Calvin, it came from Augustine. Okay, you just have to understand that. I mean, a lot of times we're looking at Calvin and some of these guys, Martin Luther and these guys. You have to understand their theology and some of these things was almost directly derived from Augustinian theology. So I want to make sure as we go forward that my intention is not to create an antagonistic relationship between Calvinists that are I have Calvinists that are friends of mine. We'll talk, sometimes we'll spar a bit about it, which is fine. It can be actually kind of enjoyable. Some of them actually think it's fun, so. But examples from history of famous and well-known Calvinist preachers, pastors: George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, Charles Spurgeon, and Francis Schaeffer. These are all amazing men of God that shaped and shook history in some way or another. Francis Schaeffer is one of these people that wrote like an Arminian. In fact, you would never have known that he was a Calvinist, except that, off to the side, he would say, yeah, well, I'm a five-pointer. And so he expresses the dichotomy. In other words, he knows that from a practical living instruction standpoint, you can't sustain the Calvinist worldview. And so he abandoned it when it came to practical teaching. And I read probably every book that Francis Schaeffer had, and I can't see a twinge. Probably read at least, not every book, but probably 10, 15 books of Francis Schaeffer's. he's supposedly a 5-point Calvinist, but he writes like an Arminian. He thinks like an Arminian. It's really, really kind of a remarkable thing. And that's not that uncommon. Francis Chan's someone like that as well. He speaks and teaches and relates much like an Arminian, but he'll say, but technically over here I'm a Calvinist. And so the guys that are really trying to live consistently with their Calvinism, they are, I would say, a little more hardcore about it. And so they're trying to consistently live with the 5 points. We'll go over the 5 points in a little bit. And it becomes problematic for them. John Piper, for instance, denies free will. A lot of them now are just outright denying free will, especially when it comes to salvation. And then the Arminian preachers, John and Charles Wesley, Charles G. Finney, Andrew Murray, Billy Sunday, and D.L. Moody. That's just a few. There's a long list on both sides of these columns. I'm just giving you some of the well-known ones that maybe perhaps you've heard of. Modern Calvinists, these are people perhaps you've read recently or looked at some of their books. We used Voddie Bauchman's book in our intensive studies last year. So it's not like, even though I'm teaching on an Arminian viewpoint, it doesn't mean that I don't see some intrinsic value in some of the things that some of our Calvinist brothers and sisters are saying. So I don't just dismiss them all. You understand? There's value in a fellow believer. Often they have a viewpoint that can be really helpful. And he had a really, really current viewpoint in his book called, not Earthquake, it's called Fractures or something like that. Fault Lines, thank you. David Platt had a great book that he came out with called Countercultures. And I've heard since then he's maybe shifted a bit, but John MacArthur's a classic Calvinist, Matt Chandler, J.I. Packer, John Piper, Louis Giglio, Del Tackett. These are some of the ones that are Calvinists that maybe perhaps you've heard of them. On the Arminian side, here's some of the ones that you've probably heard of. Bill Johnson from Bethel Church, Chuck Smith, who's now deceased, Calvary Chapel, James Dobson from Focus on the Family, which interestingly aligned with Del Tackett. Isn't that interesting? So sometimes we can work together. It's not always, doesn't have to always be fault lines between us. Lauren Cunningham with YWAM, probably the largest and most aggressive, effective single missionary organization in the world. Youth with a Mission. Lauren Cunningham's still alive. David Wilkerson, who began Team Challenge many years ago. He's also deceased. Billy Graham, deceased, but he was a well-known Arminian. He preached like an Arminian, although he was Southern Baptist. And Winky Pratney, who's an author, a friend, and he's written many books. So those are examples of Arminians and Calvinist individuals. But even though I say all that and say that we can have crossover, we can embrace, we can have fellowship, it doesn't mean that it doesn't matter, because it actually really does matter. I'll tell you why it matters. Why does the theology regarding election, sovereignty, and free will matter? So I'm going to give you some questions. This is 3 questions that I put up on the screen, but I have a number of others that I added to that. The first 3 were, are the worst heinous acts of human beings toward each other actually all part of the plan of God? This is one of the questions it begs when we talk about a Calvinist viewpoint. How do we approach personal challenges? Sickness, loss of job, marriage issues. Is it all just meant to be? Is it a que sera? Whatever will be anyway. It doesn't matter. Does prayer actually matter? Does it actually make a difference? Or in other words, can the future outcome be altered as a result of prayer? Does prayer really change things? That was a very common motto many years ago. Prayer changes things. Prayer changes things. But does it really? Okay, so, yeah, okay. Is everything that happens happening according to God's master plan and thus His will? That is the question on the table. Is the future hardwired? Is everything that happens in the future predetermined, or is there some negotiability? Are people chosen by God for salvation apart from their own choice to be saved or not? Does God send people to hell based on His choice of electing them rather than their own choice? If we believe that God chooses who will go to heaven and hell respectively, independently of their decision, then how can He hold them responsible for a decision they could not help? You don't have to think of that, but think about that one a minute. Is God responsible for all the good and evil that takes place? If it all depends on God, then why should we evangelize or send missionaries? Now, when I say all that, you have to understand there are Calvinist missionaries. There are Calvinists that evangelize. But what I'm saying is they are willing to do that despite their belief system, which is often the case. If we believe that everything that happens is a part of the perfect plan of God, then how do we avoid a fatalistic approach to life? Why does anything that I do matter at all if it's all been predetermined in its minutiae? So those are the questions, some of the questions that I think we're going to try to delve into, try to answer over the next 3 weeks. I have a notable thought for you, some thoughts here concerning Augustine. In the early 5th century, Augustine of Hippo has the dates he lived there. Of the new Roman Catholic Church created a shift in the understanding of election. It was understood this way all the way to Martin Luther and John Calvin. Their views presented an idea of election that superseded and contradicted the ideas of human free will and upheld the idea that God arbitrarily selects who will be saved and who will be lost based on His choice alone. For the first 3 centuries, the early church unequivocally held to the idea of free will, the free will of man, and emphasized an individual's personal responsibility to respond to God for salvation. And I can give you the documentation. I've got an appendix right now where I can literally give you quotes from practically every single church father for the first 300 years and their position on free will. It's amazing we have the records, isn't it? Okay, so then comes along, after all this time, Jacob Arminius comes along, or James Arminius. He is a Dutch theologian. He was a Dutch theologian who was a Calvinist, who began to change his views. He began to challenge. In fact, as I had read earlier today, actually, that he was being called in to participate in a court trial of someone deviating from Calvinism. And as he was having to build a case against this individual, he began to look at it and go, wait a minute, do I really believe that? Do I really think this way? And so he began to gather students in he was a Bible instructor in a seminary, a Reformed seminary. When I say Reformed, I'm talking about a Calvinist seminary. A lot of guys that are Calvinists that sound Reformed, they're really the same thing, but when they say Reformed, they're wanting to refer to the Reformation, to the historical shift that took place in Europe, which we're thankful actually that happened. But most people that I've ever talked to that are Reformed, I can't even think of a single one that would sound Reformed. They're not a 5-pointer. I mean, I know you're probably wondering, what's a 5-pointer? We'll get to that in a minute. 5-pointer means that you really hold to all the basic dogmas of Calvinism. All right, so the Dutch theologian Jacobus Arminius began to question a number of things regarding the viewpoints, and it's a little faded on that screen, but on the left-hand side, some of the Arminian concepts that were originating from him, and then others that took it and ran with it, were that there's a free will or human ability. That's the first one on the left column. Conditional election, universal redemption or general atonement. The Holy Spirit can be effectually resisted, and falling from grace. Okay, so those are the kind of the basic concepts that were coming with Jacob Arminius and his ideas. So a lot of his students were beginning to listen to him and believe what he's saying. It made sense. It made more sense than what they'd always been taught. He was brought to account, and Jacob Arminius actually, they were saying, hey, are you not teaching you're not teaching consistent with Calvin? And, what's the deal? And so he said, oh, yeah, no, I'm still all in. And so he was rather deceptive about it, but he also learned that when you're not, they burn you at the stake. So, and if they really don't like you, on green wood. So it burns really long and slowly. So you look it up. John Calvin, he supervised the burning of a guy at the stake on green wood. Servius, I believe, was his name, because he was not completely orthodox and wouldn't recant. So anyway, so those guys started learning that this is not a good way to end things. So the response, so after Jacob Arminius died, his ideas had taken a hold. They had taken a life of their own. And so they held a big conference, a court, if you will, to find out, okay, how are we going to combat these false ideas from Jacob Arminius? Boy, he has left us with a mess. How are we going to straighten this out? And so the reformers came up with 5 points to combat the 5 points that I'm relating that were emblematic of Arminian theology. And so their 5 points are what you see on the right: total inability or total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement or particular redemption, irresistible grace or the efficacious call of the Spirit, perseverance of the saints. Now, I know a lot of that probably just seems like a little bit of jargon, but I want you to start grasping. So as we look at, this is what's called the acronym TULIP. If we go to the next screen, that would be the 5 points of Calvinism. If you see the TULIP spelled out. So these are the reaction, the response to Jacob Arminius' positions. You have to remember at this time, the whole world was either Calvinist, Reformed, Calvinist/Reformed, or Catholic. It was one or the other. So you have to realize Arminian thoughts and ideas is just in its very beginning. It was just a little egg trying to hatch, okay? And it's almost hard to believe that it developed the way it has over the last 500, 400 years. So these were the 5 points to combat the Arminian ideas. And one of the things I want to mention here is that there were actually some individuals that had pre-Arminian ideas. Those ideas that Jacob Arminius came up with were not necessarily brand new to him. He was the place where it really took off. He had credibility, had momentum. He was within the establishment. But the Moravians and the Anabaptists had many of Jacob Arminius' ideas already. In fact, those groups are thought of as being Arminian, but in fact, they preceded Jacob Arminius. So a lot of those things on the left-hand column were subscribed to by the Anabaptists, who are the originators of the entire Brethren movement, the Quakers, the Moravians, all the various Brethren movements that spun off of the Quakers, and on you go. And these were all distinctly Arminian movements. So it's interesting because the Anabaptist Moravians, it had tremendous influence on John Wesley. And John Wesley is probably the one you see in your historical timeline. He's probably the one that catapulted Arminian thought onto the world scene like nobody else. And he used to have regular discussions and arguments and debates with John Whitefield about it. But they were dear friends, by the way, regardless. Okay, so TULIP, total depravity. And so some people refer to this as moral inability. It means that man has been born in sin, and so therefore he is helplessly a sinner and he can't help himself. He doesn't have the capacity within to make a moral choice, either to accept God or reject him. So therefore he is totally depraved. Unconditional election means that God elects and chooses people who will be saved unconditionally, meaning that it's his choice and has nothing to do with anything that they have to do. It is an arbitrary decision for all practical purposes. So God chooses by his own independent, and then limited atonement. It really makes sense for it to be limited. So why would atonement need to be for the entire world when only a few are going to be saved who God chooses? So atonement really just needs to apply to the ones that are elect. So it's called limited for that purpose. Irresistible grace is pretty simple, but it just means that a person who God has elected to be saved cannot resist. You follow? In other words, if you've been chosen and God chose you from before the foundation of the world and has all been part of this meticulous, extravagant plan, and you were chosen, you're elect, then you cannot resist the beckoning of the Spirit. It is irresistible. So we're going to go through scriptures over a lot of this in the next 2 weeks, but for now I'm trying to lay out a framework for you. So perseverance of the saints is the idea that if a person is truly saved, and a lot of times I think this is actually true, that if a person is truly saved, they will stick it out. There are many people that they waffle, they lose interest, they kind of seem to get saved, and they probably weren't really saved. Oftentimes, people are just having an emotional response or reaction. But the idea here in Perseverance of the Saints is that everyone who's elect, who could not resist the grace of God, every single one of those individuals will persevere to the end. They will not backslide. So here's what I want you to get. All 5 of these, when taken as a whole, deny free will. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see it. And that's why Calvinists will have a really hard time when you start talking about free will, because if they understand it at all, they understand these 5 points deny free will. And the ones that are honest about it, they'll say yes, or deny free will. And I've talked to many of them, they'll say, no, I don't believe in free will. Not when it comes to the choice of salvation. Maybe for the mundane things, you can make up your mind about things. But other than that, the one that really matters, the one that really counts, no. It's all God's choice. You have no part whatsoever. That's it. So, it is a logically consistent system. All 5 of these work together as a whole. It is that consistency in the system that's attractive to people. They buy in. It's a system of philosophy. It's not really a biblical system, as we'll see. All of these collectively deny free will. I would say it's just practically un-American. I'm like, how in the world do you deny free will? The foundation of TULIP, where did it all come from? The foundation is not these 5 points. It's beneath the 5 points. And this is what comes from Augustine big time. The foundation of the 5 points of Calvinism is built around Augustinian's idea of God's sovereignty. His definition of sovereignty is the whole thing is built on his particular definition of sovereignty. It all falls apart or stands on their definition of sovereignty. So we've got to look at that. The foundation of TULIP. How can God, and here's the problem. In other words, how can God be truly sovereign unless He controls everything? That was the premise. That was Augustine's premise. I know we're talking about Augustine, a guy that lived in, like 400 AD. But he had a lot of influence. And one of the reasons he had a lot of influence is because the imperial government loved his theology. But the early church, to a great extent, was very divided and were not buying into the Augustinian theology. But the imperial government, which was somewhat in cahoots now with Christianity, they loved his theology because what it did is it gave them the basis to force people to do things. And they liked that. They liked an authoritarian God. They liked a God who was a bully and pushed people around and make them do things like get saved. Because it meant it gave them a cover. So, how can God be truly sovereign unless He controls everything? That was the premise. And so the premise is, if you start with that logical point, well, He can't be sovereign if He does not control everything. And I'll tell you right now, if the God that you believe in, the God that you serve, you believe has to be sovereign of everything that happens. He has to control everything that happens. That is not the God of the Bible. It's somebody else. Because the God of the Bible believes in freedom, believes in liberty, and He gives people a lot of room to make decisions and make choices. So here I'm going to give you 3 quotes from Augustine himself. These are quotes, and they're a little bit Old English. A lot of these were translated over 100 years ago, so they're a little awkward. So try to follow me here. All right, so, for He is not truly called Almighty if He cannot do whatsoever He pleases, or if the power of His almighty will is hindered by the will of any creature whatsoever. You follow that? So in other words, the will of God must be done. It's always done, or He is not sovereign. He is the Almighty God, and He's only Almighty because everything follows His will. Next quote. Intelligent creatures, both angels and humans, sinned, doing not His will but their own. He used their willful sin as an instrument for carrying out His will. For in the very fact that they acted in opposition to His will, His will concerning them was fulfilled. So there's a little mental gymnastics there. I don't know if you followed that. But he's saying, yeah, it appears that they defied God's will, but in the end they did God's will. Now there's a circular logic. In other words, because I already believe that everything that happens is the will of God, so therefore, even though they were not doing the will of God, they were doing the will of God. Okay, you got that, right? Okay. All right. Next, the third quote. To us, therefore, words or prayers are necessary, so that by them we may be helped to consider and reflect on what we ask, not as means by which we expect that God is to be either informed or moved to compliance. You follow? In other words, prayer becomes kind of a therapy technique, but it doesn't change anything. Right? And that is a very common belief by many of the Reformed Calvinists today, that prayer is kind of an exercise in emotions. Okay, now, Augustine's view of sovereignty directly affected his view of free will. Now, I'm going to spend more time on free will next week, I believe, because I want you to see where the doctrine of free will is in the Bible. So you can see why it would naturally lead. Oh, this is what I was going to say. If you say do a Google search, Augustine and free will, you'll find a lot of writings from Augustine on free will that are just wonderful, amazing. He sounded just like the early church fathers for the first 300 years. And this is what confuses people a little bit when they read Augustine, is he changed at the end of his life. So he changed dramatically at the end of his life. And unfortunately, it was that dramatic shift in his definition of sovereignty as having to be complete control of everything. It was that definition that shifted, and it's that definition that also caused him also to deny free will. So, and part of the denial of free will goes to his view of what we're talking about in Arminian on the TULIP is total depravity. And so Augustine also originated the idea that because of Adam's sin, man lost, even though Adam had the freedom to choose and to make decisions, that everyone subsequent to Adam did not have the freedom to choose because they were now contaminated hopelessly by Adam's sin. And that hence leads to the baptism of babies and so forth, because they actually believed, because of that doctrine, that babies are born literally guilty and sinful, and so therefore they must be baptized, because if they were to die, they would go to hell. That's where it comes from. So, first quote from Augustine, he says, free choice of the will was present in that man who was the first to be formed, but after he sinned by that free will, we who have descended from his progeny have been plunged into necessity. So when they use the word necessity, what they mean is that you have a compulsion. You can't help to sin. He says, another quote, by Adam's transgression, the freedom of the human will has been completely lost. By the greatness, a third quote, these are all from different sources, by the way. By the greatness of the first sin, we have lost the free will to love God. And finally, he said, by subverting the rectitude in which he was created, he is followed with the punishment of not being able to do right. And the freedom to abstain from sin has been lost as a punishment of sin. So in other words, he's saying you have no capacity to not sin, but you're going to be punished for doing it anyway. That's what he's saying. All right, so that, anyway, I thought it would be fun to actually look at some of the actual words of Augustine. If I had read a lot of his earlier writings on free will, you'd have just been, wow, that's awesome. I mean, really good stuff. It's almost hard to believe it's the same person. So every church father, I've already stated this, but every church father in the first 300 years prior to Augustine, and Augustine in his early life to include in that whole thing, advocated for the free will of man and denied the doctrine of moral inability as espoused here by Augustine. This becomes atheist fodder to attack the church. And you'll notice if you ever have atheists on your Facebook and you get discussions or debates, they will, when they attack Christianity, they nearly always attack Calvinism, because they think that represents what we all believe. They believe the Reformed ideology or philosophy is what we all believe. So therefore, when they attack us, they're attacking. And I got on one, I have a couple atheists still friends of mine on Facebook, and I remember telling one of them, they put this whole thing up, and I said, I agree with everything you just said. They were like speechless. They didn't know how to respond. So one of the most common objections by the new atheists is toward the errant view of Calvinist ideas. They have much ammunition when it comes to portraying the God of the Bible through this lens. How can he be a good and loving if his will is expressed in such horrific ways? In other words, as we go on, you'll see the consistency and the fact that he punishes people for a choice they can't help. People are rewarded to go to heaven. They were elected. They were chosen. They're no choice of their own. Everybody else goes to hell. But they can't help it. They can't help it. They can't help to make any other choice because they were not elect. Defining sovereignty. Remember I said that's the foundation. That's where it all the house of cards is all built on the definition of sovereignty. So we must define sovereignty from a biblical standpoint, not just whatever we think it is. And so what they thought it was, and what they thought for 1,000 years was the sovereignty meant that God controls everything and the minutiae of all things. And therefore, logically, that means everything that happens ultimately is the will of God. And ultimately, everything that happens is the perfect will of God. That's what it means when He controls everything. So sovereignty, and if you're just looking up in the dictionary, what does it say? This is the American Heritage Dictionary. Definition is supremacy or authority or rule as exercised by a sovereign or sovereign state. It means royal rank, authority, or power. It means complete independence and self-government. Basic definition. It has nothing to do with being in total control. That's how we use the word sovereign in ordinary language. That's how we think it. That's what we think it means. So in Texas, I love it. At the end of a wedding, I'll do the final thing. I'll say, by the authority, as a minister of the gospel, so forth, and by the authority of the state of Texas, I'll say the sovereign state of Texas, right? Well, I wish Texas would reassert its sovereignty. It has a constitutional sovereignty as a state in the United States. It has a jurisdiction. It has a realm in which it has control, and it has the ability to make laws and to punish people who violate those laws and so forth. And so it can be sovereign, but it doesn't mean it's unlimited or that it controls everything. That's a normal use of the word. God is sovereign. But it does not mean that He controls everything in the minutiae of it all. It just means He's sovereign in the way that the ordinary word means sovereign. God is the supreme sovereign of the universe. He is the supreme ruler and judge of the universe. All of us will stand before Him one day as our sovereign Lord. Most Calvinists, including Augustine, believe that unless God is controlling the minutiae of all things absolutely, then He cannot really be sovereign. They define sovereignty as having to mean complete and absolute control over all things. So then it presents an antinomy. Antinomy is a word that J.I. Packer used in his book. He's a Calvinist, but when he wrote the book, I'd say he's a conflicted Calvinist. Because he wanted to hold on to free will. He's trying to hold on to free will. He's trying to hold on to Calvinism. He writes this book. I remember reading it when I was in college. But he comes up with this idea, and I never forgot it, called antinomy. Antinomy is, if you look at the definition, it means a contradiction between principles or conclusions that seem equally necessary and reasonable, a paradox. So he believed, J.I. Packer, that God is sovereign and in control of everything, like a good Calvinist should believe, but he wanted to hold on to free will. So he says, well, it's a contradiction. He says, but we've got to have both. So he says this is antinomy. So what that means is that I'm going to hold this. In other words, it's just a plain old contradiction. They're two things logically that are completely opposite. The two cannot both be true at the same time. If I say something's black and white at the same time, they are not both. They're one or the other. You see, and that's just basic logic. And this, when we talked about how you interpret the Bible is a logical book. It is an antithetical book. And so when you have things which logically break down like this, you need to step back and go, hey, wait a minute, maybe we're not seeing this right. In other words, whenever we see a contradiction or two things which logically are not meshing, we tend to step back and go, wait, I'm not seeing this right. This is maybe another perspective, another way to understand this. But so what's happened among, I suppose, many Calvinists or people that are somewhat reformed is trying to hold on to free will, the purpose of evangelism and some of these types of things, because they see the Great Commission, they see the Scripture compels us to evangelize and these kinds of things. That doesn't make logical sense with the fact that God is the one in control of all of that, then why are we even having a part in this? And so there's a logical breakdown on the whole thing. And so here we are. So most of the Calvinists that I've heard over so many recent years, they just went ahead and surrendered, and they said, well, it's impossible to hold on to free will and the 5 points. They finally they're trying to be more consistent logically with their position. But Packer was being a good sport. He was trying to figure out, how do we do this? So biblical sovereignty. I just defined sovereignty. God is sovereign. And we know that it does not mean that God controls everything, and all you have to do is read the Bible. And you can see over and over and over. We'll look at a lot of these passages, but just to reference a few, you have Genesis chapter 6, where God looks at the sin of the world. He looks at how they had built generationally on a momentum of sin, which was nauseating. It was beyond comprehension. According to God's perspective, it was just evil continually, it says in Genesis. And it says that God said, I'm sorry that I made man. It said it repented him. He was grieved in his heart. He was sorry that he made man. Like, so what a statement. What an incredible statement on the grief in the heart of God. When you look at it just on its face value, you have to look at that and go, wait a minute, something went wrong. Something's gone terribly wrong. Was it God's fault? Or is it somebody else's fault? A free moral agent has intrinsic to being a free moral agent is personal responsibility. And so God held free moral agents responsible for the choices they were making, and He had to contain the evil. Dramatic containment measures after a very long, drawn-out period of building the ark, and Noah's a preacher of righteousness trying to reason with the people and warn them of what's coming. And so God judged the world. And we, all of us here in this room right now, are the descendants of Noah. We're the survivors. He was sorry that He made man. And so what I want you to see is, I'm just giving you one example, but there are many, 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 many of these examples where God expresses complete disdain for choices that are being made by people and holding them responsible, as though they had free will. Gasp. As though He was not in control of everything that's happening. We all know that we make choices and decisions all the time, that God is not a grand puppeteer, making us do stuff. Oh, I did something really bad. I guess that was meant to be. I stole that bubble gum in that store. I guess that was meant to be. It must have been God's will. I know I'm being a little facetious, but understand that His sovereignty is jurisdictional. This is very important. You have to understand the biblical view of God's sovereignty is jurisdictional, meaning that Texas has a jurisdiction. You see law enforcement agencies. I'll give you examples that we see all the time from a legal standpoint. Law enforcement agencies have jurisdictions. So right now we have a big combative problem, not combative, but a disagreeable problem on the border today, because the federal agencies, the Border Patrol, has the jurisdiction to control the border. The law enforcement of Texas does not have that jurisdiction in the Constitution. So we have this big problem because we want to control the border, so we're willing to step on the toes, or are we? We're willing to step on the toes of the jurisdiction of the federal government. But that's why there's so much hesitancy about how far can we take this. Well, we're just going to build our own wall. Or we're going to do this, we're going to do that. We might even have to deport, but we don't have the authority to do that. So for Texas to reassert its sovereignty, you see how jurisdictions work? Well, God designed it that way. That's the way governments work. That's the way you see it in the Scripture many times over, where prophets have a jurisdiction, kings have a jurisdiction, you have families and the rule of families, they have their own jurisdiction, their own realm. And then you have you as an individual, you have a jurisdiction, you have a realm of influence and a latitude of choices that you make in your life. Those are all kind of jurisdictional subsets of the universe that God created. And it's how He did it as the sovereign of the universe, as the supreme power. He set up the whole thing in order. And the order was done in terms of jurisdictions. That's how He exercised His sovereignty. And it's a matter of design. There's a lot of things that we say. Oh man, I was going to have a little Q&A. I was already there. Things that we say oftentimes. Well, after all, God's in control. Really? Are you sure? In control of what exactly? What are you referring to? He's in control of something, but He's in control of that. But people make these statements. They're Augustinian statements. Well, God allowed that for a reason. Oh, nothing happens unless it first passes through His hand. And these are all ways of subtly blaming God and putting responsibility on Him for awful things people are doing to each other, that He is going to hold them accountable for. So these expressions suggest that God is somehow responsible for what is happening, even horrible things. After all things work together for good. And we quote part of the Scripture. Technically, everything that occurs was allowed. So we're not saying anything to say, well, it was allowed. Isn't everything that's happening allowed? I mean, it's not really saying anything. Well, that was allowed for a reason. Well, everything happening is allowed. The United States is allowing Cuba to exist. We didn't just blow them up with a nuclear bomb, so we're allowing them to exist. See, that's how dumb that idea is. Okay, same idea. All right, so I'm going to try to express this idea of jurisdictions and why it is that it's not God's fault. So I give my kids the keys of the car, and they are 17. And they go out with friends. They're breaking all the household rules. They go out with friends. They start drinking, and they start swerving and driving too fast, and they run into a tree, and one of the kids gets killed or whatever, some horrible thing. They destroy the car. And so would people blame me because I'm the parent and I gave them the keys of the car when they were 17? It was all legal? No. The kid made some really bad decisions, and they are going to suffer the consequences of those decisions as an adult driving that vehicle, right? But it's not me. So God's given us the keys of the car, and we went out and drunk and drove too fast and ran into a tree, and we destroyed everything. That's essentially more close to the model that we're talking about. And yet we want to put it on Him, like put it on the parent for allowing that. And we don't do that in real life. All of us as parents have kids that go out. Every one of my kids wrecked a car. Okay, so God remains active. This is my concluding statement. God remains active in the ebb and flow of human history, while at the same time leaving us completely free and unrestrained in the choices that we make, the good choices and the bad choices. So we'll take a little time. Well, we'll take at least 10 minutes if you guys have comments or questions. And remember, we have 2 more parts. There's a lot of other things we're going to cover. So if you could try to kind of keep it within the context of what we covered tonight, that would be great. Anybody?
I just have a quick comment. I can understand kind of the mental gymnastics that God is sovereign, and He knows the end from the beginning, and He knows whose name is in the book of life. And I can kind of understand where that theology comes from and that viewpoint, where you just try to make it simple. God is great. We don't understand everything about Him. It's a paradox. And I can see that. And yet at the same time, that takes all of the responsibility off of us And it also turns it where we're just floating through. So I just wanted to share that. I think that's my understanding of what you discussed tonight.
So I just had a weird comment, but I was thinking about it, and I've always thought it was interesting because it feels like when you have children, it's kind of God telling you, hey, guess what? Here's a sample of what I dealt with, because he created us. And then as I was thinking about, being able to make good and bad choices and allowing them to happen, it's kind of interesting because I kept thinking about artificial intelligence and how, as humans create artificial intelligence, we actually celebrate the failures and the successes because it helps it evolve. And it's just kind of interesting when you start looking at the full picture of, it makes sense that God would want you to have free will because that's the ultimate form of creation, is to have something that honors you by choice, that develops that by itself. So it's just interesting to me.
And I think it expresses his image when we're made in his image. That would, to me, one of those powerful characteristics of human beings who are free moral agents. And that's like God. That's what he is. Yes.
I think that ties back to the definition of love too. I mean, it's impossible to have somebody truly love you, but then not have free will. It's like, well, if somebody really does love you, they have to choose that in order for it to be real. So God can't, he didn't make us a bunch of robots. Would that really be true love? Would that be true relationship? But by giving us that choice, the fact that we choose to love him, we choose to worship him, it means that much more because it's a choice that we get to make.
Yeah, good.
It was interesting when you said God's sovereignty is jurisdictional. And I think of, he has designed jurisdictions for a reason, like he puts boundaries in place for a reason. It's for our protection and for our comfort and for our safety. And so if you didn't have free will, that would be gone.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That reminds me of when Adam and Eve were created and God gave them free reign. He said, you name the animals, like you cultivate, like you do this, you do it. He was the creator and organizer of it all. So that's what it makes me think whenever you say jurisdictional, like they still could have like their own way within his jurisdiction. And clearly they had their own way and were kicked out of that said jurisdiction.
It's interesting that Adam and Eve, who did not have any inherited sinful tendencies or any dark or fallen world to come into, they came into the pristine Garden of Eden, that they still rebelled and sinned against God, as though we needed all of the other stuff to be capable of rebelling against God. They proved the point that we're very capable of, as human beings, of rebelling against God because of our intrinsic free will. Anybody else?
That made me laugh because I was just thinking that's one clear way that we can see that we're made in God's image, because you don't see birds deciding, I'm not going to fly today, I'm just going to walk everywhere. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But we can do such things.
Free will is an amazing thing. Anybody else? I hope you're learning something tonight.
Where are those documents that you said? The ones
Which documents?
I guess the ones that were kind of earlier in the presentation. The ones that Augustine's the Augustine documents.
Okay, the one was called the NP. It had the references. Yeah, that refers to Nicene, post-Nicene, pre-Nicene. In other words, church fathers, those letters stand for post-Nicene.
Okay, yeah.
Meaning the Nicene conference that they had. So the church fathers after that date, there's a volume of books that compiles many of the writings of these various church leaders, including Augustine. So that's where those come from.
Is it expensive to purchase?
Yeah. Do I have those?
Yeah, those are the documents. The ones that you said that I can pull up the documents I can show you.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can go online and read all this for yourself. That's what I was trying to say, is these documents are there, they're available. You can read that. I was saying, isn't it amazing that even the first 300 years that we have the writings of these early church fathers? It's really amazing when you think that Diocletian tried to destroy every written script of Christianity right before, the end of the 300-year
I was
period.
just about to go into the net library and start scrounging for it. I was like, where is it?
It's all online. I mean, it's all public domain. I mean, you can get it. You can go find it. So have fun reading volumes and volumes of information. So it's helpful to narrow it down by topic if you have an interesting. That's why I read you a number of different quotes from Augustine. But what I found myself reading a lot of information from him when he was still a free will advocate. And I mean, he sounded like me. I mean, it was remarkable to listen to his arguments he was making, advocating free will.
Yeah.
I know we're at the end of time here. So what
Yeah, it is.
what made him switch at the very end? Because I'm more intrigued by the earlier stuff that he wrote, but was there something that happened in his life or something that, I mean, I don't know a whole lot about it, but what caused him to switch at the end of his life and develop that new point of view?
You'd probably have to do a lot of research on that, and I don't know that it's even clear, but we know that he did. But he had a couple of long-standing arguments with some different groups. The Pelagians were one of them. So he would have these long-term discussions and arguments. And I think some have supposed that, and I think part of it was the imperial incentive. The amount of power and clout that he gained from the imperial state by adopting doctrines which were actually, the other thing that is pointed out when you look at the literature on Augustine was that he was heavy in the Gnostic teaching before he became a Catholic leader. And it's supposed that some of these ideas were his revisiting some of the Gnostic ideas, and he mixed them with what was otherwise Orthodox teaching. And that's one of the theories, was that he was perhaps a little confused. I don't know. Gnosticism, it comes from the idea of knowledge, the word knowledge, but it comes from the idea of secret knowledge, that they believed they had kind of an inroad. They were considered false teachers. They had a lot of strange ideas, but the church, by and large, rejected the Gnostic teaching. But they were considered heresy. They would deny that Jesus came in the flesh. They would, they had a lot of, you can look it up, but that was one of them. And so the early church established early on that Jesus, in fact, was God who came in the flesh as a human being, and the deity of Christ was uncontested. He wasn't a spirit being. He was actually a human being that lived among us. So these things were well established in the church. So the Gnostics were coming in with all those weird ideas that were inconsistent with some of those beliefs that were held true by, starting with the apostles and their teaching. Didn't line up, it didn't mesh up. But they claimed to have special insight.
Question on the Gnostics. Did that originate in Greece? The Gnostic teaching, or their kind of doctrine?
I don't know where it originated. I think it was widespread in the whole of the known world at that time.
So before Jesus?
Well, the Gnostic heresies were Christians, or proclaiming to be Christians, with a false slant on Jesus.
Okay.
Now, maybe some of their ideas were coming from Platonic ideas and things like that. I don't know. We'd have to do a lot of research to find out, where were they getting their ideas from.
Yeah.
Oh, what'd you say? You want to go and do the research, Sheila? Go ahead. Give us a report next week. Yeah, I know. Go give us a report next week. Tell us where the Gnostics got their ideas. I'm just messing with you. We had another minute. Anybody else? Greek-speaking world was all over the Mediterranean. It was a whole known world at that time.
Okay, so my question is, what about the prophecies? I mean, isn't this where God is telling the future? Is this where he's exercising some sovereignty, some control?
Well, he has sovereignty,
Yeah.
right? We
Right.
established that he is the sovereign ruler of the universe. We haven't talked about foreknowledge in that realm. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, that's not a realm that we probably should go into tonight. That's a whole nother world of discussion. But the fact is, if somebody says, I'm going to go crash that car into that tree, I can make it happen. And I can predict the future that's going to happen. Because I am involved in the process of the cause and effect of that happening. God can be involved in the cause and effect of bringing about his own prophecies. You know, I mean, it's not like individuals' lives, sure.
Individuals, see, he will speak to them, and there's a desire on his part or a will that he has for them, but they can resist it, but
Right, they can resist. Right.